What if I told you that some of the biggest turning points in history weren't caused by brilliant generals or unstoppable armies, but by colossal blunders? We often celebrate the genius of military leaders, but today, we read diving into the other side of the coin, the worst military strategy mistakes that literally changed the world. These aren't just minor miscalculations. These are facepalm moments on a global scale. Let's start with a classic, Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Russia in 1812. On paper, it looked like a sure win. Napoleon had the Grande Armée, the largest European army ever assembled, with over 500,000 soldiers. He was the undisputed master of Europe. His plan? A quick, decisive battle to force Tsar Alexander I to the negotiating table. But Napoleon made a critical error. He completely underestimated his opponent's greatest weapon, Russia itself. Instead of meeting him for a glorious battle, the Russian army just kept retreating deeper and deeper into the vast, unforgiving Russian interior. They practiced a scorched earth policy, burning villages, crops, and supplies, leaving nothing for the invading French army to live off. Napoleon's supply lines, already stretched thin, completely broke down. He eventually reached a deserted and burning Moscow, but there was no one there to surrender. He had won the battle but lost the war. The infamous Russian winter set in, and the retreat became one of the greatest disasters in military history. Of the more than 500,000 men who marched in, fewer than 100,000 made it out. This catastrophic failure was the beginning of the end for Napoleon, shattering the myth of his invincibility and leading directly to his downfall. Next, let's fast forward to World War I and the Gallipoli Campaign. The year is 1915. The Western Front is a bloody stalemate of trench warfare. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, championed a bold plan: knock the Ottoman Empire, an ally of Germany, out of the war. The idea was to force a naval passage through the Dardanelles Strait, capture the capital, Constantinople, now Istanbul, and open a supply route to Russia. It was a brilliant idea in theory. The problem? The execution was a complete mess. First, the element of surprise was lost. The British and French navies tried to force the strait alone and failed, alerting the Ottomans to their intentions. This gave the Turkish forces, commanded by the soon-to-be famous Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, ample time to dig in and fortify the Gallipoli Peninsula. When the Allied troops, mostly made up of brave soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs finally landed, they were met with a wall of fire. They landed on the wrong beaches, narrow strips of sand at the bottom of steep, heavily defended cliffs. What was supposed to be a swift campaign turned into 8 months of brutal trench warfare, with horrendous casualties on both sides from combat and disease. The Allies eventually had to admit defeat and evacuate. The campaign was a total failure, achieving none of its objectives and costing over 500,000 casualties. Now, let's jump to the Second World War, a conflict filled with strategic blunders. But one stands out for its sheer arrogance: Hitler's decision to halt his panzer divisions at Dunkirk in 1940. After storming through France and the Low Countries with their blitzkrieg tactics, the German army had the British Expeditionary Force and French allies cornered against the English Channel at the port of Dunkirk. The tanks stopped for 3 crucial days. Was it because Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised he could annihilate the trapped army from the air? Was Hitler worried about his panzers getting bogged down in the marshy ground? Whatever the reason, it was a monumental mistake. This pause gave the British the miracle they needed. In a desperate, improvised effort called Operation Dynamo, a flotilla of over 800 vessels, everything from naval destroyers to tiny civilian fishing boats and private yachts, crossed the channel under constant air attack. They managed to rescue over 338,000 Allied soldiers, snatching them from the jaws of defeat. While Britain lost all its heavy equipment, it saved its army. These were the experienced soldiers who would form the core of the force that would eventually return to liberate Europe. If those men had been captured, it's very likely Britain would have been forced to surrender, and the entire course of the war would have been different. Much like Napoleon, Hitler underestimated his enemy and the brutal Russian winter. He believed the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with a single kick. He launched the largest land invasion in history, expecting a swift victory before winter set in. Initially, the Germans made staggering advances, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers. But the Soviet Union, like Russia before it, just absorbed the blow. And finally, let's consider a more modern example: the initial stages of the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The core strategic mistake was a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the conflict. U.S. military leaders, fresh from their experiences in World War II and Korea, viewed Vietnam through the lens of conventional warfare. They focused on metrics like body counts and winning large-scale battles, believing that if they could inflict enough casualties on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army, they would eventually give up. This was the war of attrition strategy. But they weren't fighting a conventional army for control of territory. They were fighting a determined nationalist and communist insurgency that was deeply embedded within the population. For the Vietnamese, this was a total war for their nation's survival, and they were willing to endure immense losses. The U.S. strategy of search and destroy missions often alienated the local population, driving them into the arms of the Viet Cong. And a failure to understand the bigger picture can be far more devastating than any single weapon. History is filled with these what-if moments, where a single bad decision sends ripples across time, shaping the world we live in today. It's a humbling reminder that even the most powerful can fall, not with a bang, but with a blunder. Thanks for watching. What other historical mistakes do you think changed the world? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey through history's biggest blunders, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more. See you next time.